Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is John Dickinson yet again. I know I'm having some audio problems, but Dr. Jane Calvert sounds just fine, and we're going to bring her right in. Dr. Jane, welcome back to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
Oh, my pleasure. So, we wanted to talk today a little bit about the John Dickinson Writings Project and certain things you're working on because you have kind of an announcement, so to speak, for tomorrow. Tell us what's going on with the Writings Project.
Right, so well, we're kind of at another big milestone. If all goes well, and we think it will, tomorrow we should be submitting volume 2 to the University of Delaware Press, and it should be available for purchase in a few weeks. I'm not exactly sure how many, but yeah. So we've been working on this volume for. Let's see, when did we start on it? It was around this time last year is when we'd been working on it for a long time before then, but we've been working on it very intensively for the last many months. And so hopefully tomorrow we'll ship it off to the press, and it'll be available on Amazon within a few weeks.
I should note, Volume 1 is available right now. Links in the description below, so you guys have to catch up before Volume 2 comes out. I'm surprised you were able to assemble it in only a year.
Well, so we've actually been working on the first few volumes over the last decade. So we've done, a lot of the work, and this last year it was just sort of, doing the last, pulling it all together and making sure everything was sort of shipshape before we send it off. And I could, it might be interesting to your readers for me to sort of talk about what's involved with these projects, so that you. So your listeners may not, or viewers may not realize, but every major founder and many of the minor ones have these, multi-volume documentary editions, where over, sometimes as many as 50 years, scholars, documentary editors, and when we say documentary editing, we're not talking about movies, we're talking about documents. And so where these scholars have gone out and looked for any document that has that founder's name on it, or is about that founder, and collected all of them, and published them in these editions. And so sort of the modern era of documentary editing started in the 1950s. And the first edition was the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, and then shortly after that, Papers of Benjamin Franklin, and so on with the other big ones. And so these projects are still going on, and were started in the 1950s. And so I think the Franklin papers started out thinking they would have 15 volumes, and they're now up to 43 or 44. So, they take a long time. They're extremely labor intensive. They require a lot of expertise. And so what happens is scholars go to the archives where these papers live, and they search through the archives, and they find as many of these documents as they can. They collect them, and they used to use, photostat machines, then Xeroxes. Now we use digital images, and they bring these documents back to their offices, and they transcribe the handwriting. It used to be with typewriters. Now we use, or handwritten, and now we use computers. But transcribe these documents, and then proofread the documents to make sure that they match exactly what's on the page. We edit them, which means we don't change the words, but we make it clear what is on the page. So, for example, if the author wrote, instead of colonies, he might have abbreviated it as COL period and then S with a superscript. Now we know that means colonies, but the average reader might not know that means colonies. So we might need to expand that But when we expand it, we have to show that the editor actually added the words in. So we put like maybe those missing letters in brackets so that the reader says, okay, the author originally wrote just COLS, but the editors added those middle letters so that it's expanded to a full word.
And you,
So we do that kind of thing. And then we add head notes, we add annotations. So any like person, place, or thing that the reader might not be familiar with, or legal terminology or foreign language, we add in a note to say that's what this means, and then we contextualize, and then we put it all together in a volume. Now, back in the day, it used to be that the editors would send off all of these the manuscript pages to the press, and the press would typeset it and make it look like a book, and then the editors would get it back and proofread it. Now in the digital age, um, we are responsible for doing what the press used to do. So we have to typeset the volume and do all that work in addition to the work that editors have traditionally done. So now Dickinson is the last of the major founders to have a documentary edition done of his works. And the reasons for that are numerous. One is that his papers, the other founders had their papers collected in the archives. They were in the archives, or available at least. And Dickinson's were in private hands until around 1940. And it wasn't until then that his descendants turned over big amounts of his papers to the archives. So they weren't even available. And then the other things that were available were scattered all around, and Dickinson didn't get the same kind of treatment that the other founders did. So a lot of the times the archivists or the librarians didn't even know that Dickinson mattered. So they just, they would catalog his letters under, say, the recipient. And so no one, if you went to look for Dickinson, there wouldn't be any Dickinson. You'd have to look under, Joe Smith or whoever he sent the letter to. So there's that. There's also just sort of all the bad press he got for, being, known as the person who didn't vote on or sign the Declaration of Independence. That's kind of another story. But then the other thing with Dickinson is that even once his papers were turned over to the archives, they were illegible. Nobody could read them.
because it's handwritten, or
And
because of
his
way
handwriting was atrocious, and his handwritten notes and his legal notes also. So he wrote in not just his crazy messy handwriting, not just with lots of deletions and insertions and marginalia every which way, but also he would write with Latin abbreviations. Sometimes the whole document would be in abbreviations, and they were idiosyncratic. So he might abbreviate something one way one time and another way another time. And no one could read these abbreviations, especially when they were abbreviations of Latin or law French, which is a combination of Latin and French, medieval Latin and French. So he was writing these things that nobody could even read. So there were about 6 or 7 attempts to collect his papers and publish them before I started doing it, and they all failed. In fact, there was one guy named Paul Lester Ford, and he actually set out to do a 2-volume edition of Dickinson's writings, and he finished the first volume, and you can find that fairly easily today. And then while he was trying to do the second volume, he was murdered by his brother.
Oh.
So that was kind of a bummer for everybody. And then there were other problems with academics, scholars like fighting with each other and finding the work too difficult, and so they all just gave up. And then I came along and was stupid enough to make a go of it.
That's
So
fantastic. Now I want
and
to ask you
you
about the murder, but that's not the point here. So, when you're assembling this, uh, I understand you speak German, but are you familiar with Latin also?
I never learned Latin and I don't read law French, and so we had to get an expert in law French to help us translate the materials in law French. And I should say at this point that I've got a really great team of scholars. I was doing this by myself for a long time, but it's not a one person project. And so I've assembled a team of really amazing scholars, some of whom work full time for the project and were grant funded, and some of whom are just sort of, working part time or just as on an as needed basis. But we have experts in everything. We have some very skilled documentary editors who've been working, long time at the George Washington papers, or the papers of Benjamin Franklin, the papers of John Adams, the papers of George Washington. So I mentioned Thomas Jefferson. Yet. So anyway, just really highly skilled people, and it takes us, around. If we've already got the materials prepped, it takes us around 2 years of intensive work to get a volume out. If we don't run into any big obstacles, which you just never know what's going to happen.
Right.
Um, if you
So,
happen to find a cache of documents that you didn't know existed at the last minute, that's kind of
right. Well, that was one of my questions. Actually, was what you said they're scattered, but is there one or two locations you found the bulk of Dickinson's work?
yeah. So the bulk are located in Philadelphia. A guy named Robert R. Logan, who is a descendant of Dickinson's, had a, a good number of documents. And what he did was he just took this big cache of documents and he more or less like ripped the collection in two and gave half of it to the Library Company of Philadelphia and the other half to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And they share a wall, but they don't combine their collections. So, um, so, so they were pretty well cataloged at the Library Company, but really not cataloged much at all at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So so anyway, it was very difficult to know what the documents were because they were undated, no titles, nobody could read them, nobody knew what was there. And until I got in there and started making these like really amazing finds, like for example, the 1777 manumission deed, first manumission deed for Dickinson's slaves. And that was just shoved into a folder of miscellaneous documents at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania.
I know I shouldn't laugh
Yeah,
at that. Obviously, that's the least funny thing in the world, but
yeah.
sad but true.
So right. There are also substantial amounts at the Library of Congress. There are a lot at the New York Public Library. There's some in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So there are even some like in Southern California or in Michigan, or and we're sure there are quite a few in England, but they're also not cataloged. So not sure how we're going to find them. So yeah, it's there's a lot there, and we're estimating at present that we'll have like I think we're estimating 11 or 12 volumes, and I hope we can keep it to that.
Keep it to
So
12, right. So, and you said you're releasing number two, you're
we're going to be
submitting number two tomorrow.
submitting it tomorrow, and it should be out available for for purchase in a few weeks. I'm not sure exactly how many,
Well, we'll be
but
sure to let everyone know when that happens. As we
yeah,
said, as
yeah.
for now, volume one is down in the description. Make sure you pick it up. Uh, where is the most random place you found some of John Dickinson's work?
I mean, there are individual letters just floating around out there. And so, even like small archives in various parts of the country could just have like one or two documents. I mean, off the top of my head, I can't think of like the most random place because I've kind of been all over the country looking for these things. But I'll think about it and let you know if I come up with something kind of weird.
Yeah,
But
next time you're back,
um,
you come up with something for that. So this is the complete works and selected correspondence.
Good. Yes, you got it. Yeah.
Finally got it. Episode, third time is charm. um,
So, it might help if I explain that a little bit.
Please, I was going to ask, are the complete works in volume one, or are you scattering the works throughout?
So when we say complete works, what I mean with that is um, works being his like published political documents. So things like the letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, or the Articles of Confederation, or things like that. So those are like what I'm calling his works. Anything that was intended for public consumption.
Right. I'm sure
I
those are
initially
easier to
was
locate.
was that
I'm sure those are
yes,
easier to locate as well, because
yes.
I mean, you can get them on all sorts of websites.
Exactly. So those are, well, we go to the originals. We
Right.
don't
No,
use
I mean,
anything
I didn't
from.
mean to imply that. Yeah, for sure. As soon as
Yeah,
I
yeah,
said, I was
yeah.
like, well, not necessarily. The Articles of
Right.
Confederation, although no, because usually you would find the finished version and not his draft.
Well, we do all of it. We do the drafts. The drafts are really what's very important because, of course, the finished version of that was, that was completely different from his draft.
Mangled. Yeah.
So yeah, mangled, right, right. So that's what I was going to do. I was only going to do that. That was my first idea. Only going to do the published material. Then I was like, well, but his drafts of those things are really important, and well, his notes are pretty important too. And then wait a minute, what about all this? So then I started thinking, well, the correspondence adds in so much detail, and not just about the documents themselves, but also about John Dickinson as a person. And so then I expanded it to be selected correspondence, and it's only selected correspondence because we just do not have the funding or the staffing to travel around the the Atlantic world or the country tracking down all of the correspondence. So we're doing what we can with the correspondence, but it's not going to be everything. We're also doing something similar with the legal documents. It's going to be what we've come across, but we can't make a concerted effort to track down everything. So it'll be better than nothing, better than what it was before, but it won't be as complete as the other founding fathers documents. Now we will have a digital edition, so we can continue to add if we find something really great. After the edition is all done, we can still add things to the digital edition.
And
Um,
are you releasing the volumes for the audience? Are you releasing the volumes chronologically, or are you doing them based on topics or by? All right, I won't even finish the question then.
yeah, chronological, everything. So the volumes are chronological, all the contents, every document is ordered chronologically. So, you'll be able to, you kind of read it like a history of what happened. And so, yeah, right, everything is chronological.
Excellent. What for volume two that you're submitting? What years are you covering?
So volume one is 1751 to 1758. Volume two is 1759 to 1763. And from there, we'll move 1764 to 66, and then 67 to 69, and so on. So, we're covering every, 2 to 3 years
So a
of
few weeks ago, the first time we came on, we discussed the history of Dickinson's political celebrity, but that
yes.
doesn't really start until after '63, probably.
Right,
So
right. So
in
he
these first
became
volumes, is
known.
there? I'm sorry, about in the first volumes, is there anything that sticks out to you as I don't know, particularly noteworthy, or do you see it coming in any way?
Oh yeah, I mean, so in volume one, it's really fantastic. It's all the letters, or most of the letters he wrote home when he was studying law in England, and they're rich and personal, and just really you see this young man. He's only in his early 20s, and he was so idealistic and so like, you know, driven, and it's just really fun to see this person, and know the person he became later. So that was really neat. But then when he got back to Philadelphia and was just, fresh out of law school, wet behind the ears, And he got sort of dragged into being the defense attorney for the Reverend William Smith, who was brought up on like these really trumped up libel charges by the Pennsylvania Assembly. And so Dickinson was he was brand new, never did anything like this before, and found himself having to argue this case in front of the Pennsylvania Assembly. And they were like threatening to threaten to throw him into jail, and they were calling him names and insulting him, and he just really gave this guy a really good freedom of speech defense, and really stood up for this idea that freedom of speech is sacred and it ought to be protected. And this was in 1758. And so yeah, that was really interesting. And there are also all these cases that he
I'm
worked
sorry to
in the
interrupt.
court of.
Do we know the results of the suit?
Oh yeah, I mean, they completely ignored. It wasn't really a suit. It was just a kangaroo court, and they totally ignored Dickinson's arguments, and they let William Smith rot in jail for months, and then they finally released him. But it took. I mean, Ben Franklin was on the other side of the ocean in England, working against Dickinson and against William Smith, and it actually took a decision from I can't remember who made the decision, but it was at the in the British government. They made the decision, I believe it was, to let him out. So yeah, it was really ugly. Um, so there was, and then there were these courses in the Admiralty Court on the flag of truce trade, which is also like really fascinating. So yeah, he was doing some really, really cool stuff early on in his career.
That's fascinating. um, like I said, we did speak. This kind of leads us into a few weeks ago. We spoke about Dickinson's early political career. We spoke a little bit about the Liberty Song, but you mentioned to me that something new came up. Could you
Yeah, so
let
I
us in
thought
on
it
the
might be
secret?
fun to revisit this. Yeah, so going back to the Liberty Song, in the biography that I'm writing, I'm working on 1768 right now. So I was really like looking, and that's volume 4 of the Dickinson writings, and I was digging into that. That volume is not done yet. Obviously, we're still working through the notes and trying to make sense of all the documents. So I was looking at the Liberty Song. I'm like, okay, I need to write about this, and all of a sudden I realized like stuff wasn't stuff wasn't hanging together. Like things were not making sense with our annotations and with the dates and everything. And so I was like, okay, what was going on here? I need to figure this out. So so I started to really puzzle it out. And here's the problem that I found. So the Liberty Song, it was first, I'm going to say the so-called Liberty Song. It was published first in Philadelphia in on July 7th, um, July 7th of 1768. And before that, uh, and then it was later published in Boston. I think it first appeared in Boston on the 18th of July. Okay, so working backwards from that, I'm looking at this, and we call it the Liberty Song, and all the histories tie the Liberty Song to the Liberty Affair that happened in Boston with John Hancock's sloop, the Liberty. And he was accused of smuggling, and the ship was confiscated by the British and later outfitted as to go and harass people in Rhode Island. And anyway, so and there were riots, and it was a big deal in Boston. The problem is that was all happening in June, when Dickinson was writing this song, before he could have known about it. So historians have made a link between these two things, the writing of this song and the Liberty Affair in Boston. They made a causal link, when I don't believe there was one.
Interesting.
I think Dickinson, what his main concern in June, when exactly the Liberty Affair was happening, it was like, I think so. It was the 10th of June is when the ship was seized, And the first lawsuit was brought against John Hancock, I think, on the 21st. Now, it takes some time for news to travel between Boston and Philadelphia, right?
Right.
It
I'm
didn't
pretty
make the
sure.
papers. It didn't make the papers in Philadelphia until June 30th. Dickinson had already been in communication with James Otis about this song
For publication.
for publication.
Right. So it was already
And
done.
it was pretty much done. Now, I misspoke before when I said that I thought James Otis had written some lines of it. It was actually Arthur Lee who wrote some lines. Arthur Lee happened to be visiting Dickinson in Philadelphia at the time. So,
Who's that? I'm sorry, Arthur Lee?
Arthur Lee of the
Lee family?
Virginia Lees.
He was
Yeah,
just about to go study medicine.
he was, and he stopped, and he actually made a special trip to Philadelphia to meet the Pennsylvania farmer on his way to London.
Very
And
interesting.
so the two of them hit it off, and they started like writing stuff. And so Arthur Lee had 8 lines of this song, and or whatever it was, and Dickinson took it over and finished it and put it to the tune Heart of Oak. And and then Dickinson wrote, he was writing other things. And now Dickinson's primary concern in June of 1768 was not what was happening in Boston. It was what was not happening in Philadelphia. And what was not happening in Philadelphia is that the Quakers were not getting on board with the Massachusetts Circular Letter. They were not joining with the other colonies in boycotting British goods and unifying against the Townshend Acts. They were digging in and refusing to join with the other colonies. So Dickinson and Lee were trying to figure out ways to goad the Quakers into joining with other colonies. So they wrote not just the Liberty Song, but they also wrote Dickinson wrote, it was like a letter from a gentleman in Philadelphia to his friend in Virginia. So Dickinson wrote this thing, and it was just a scathing attack on the Quakers. And then he wrote, and he'd already given an address to merchants on the same topic in April. And then he wrote another pamphlet called it was called To the Public, and he called himself Pacificus. And he just again reamed them. And in one of them, he accused the Quakers of like prostituting their patriotism to their self-interest. I mean, it was really brutal. So that's what he was worried about at the very moment he and Arthur Lee were working on the so-called Liberty Song. He didn't call it the Liberty Song. He called it either a song or a new song. Later historians called it the Liberty Song.
Oh, that's interesting. Those are poor titles for a very good writer.
But
A song isn't necessarily a number 1 hit.
well, when he wrote to James Otis, he called it a song for American freedom.
That's sexier. That's a song you
It
can
is.
sell.
He did. It wasn't a title. He just said, "Here's my song for American freedom." And the only thing he asked Otis about, he didn't ask Otis about anything to do with the Liberty affair. He asked Otis, he's like, "Wait, are we really sure that there were like placemen and pensioners, who were taking this money?" And because that's in the song about placemen and pensioners. And so he was asking Otis about that, not about Hancock or the ship Liberty. So, we're still putting we're still polishing this up and putting the finishing touches on it. But, I don't think there's very good evidence at all. In fact, I think there's virtually no evidence that there is any connection between the so-called Liberty Song and the Liberty Affair in Boston.
Well, there it is, Founder fans. Myth exterminated. Dr. Jane, thank you so much for coming with us. You're going to come back very soon, I presume, because I have 1,000 more questions to ask you about literally everything you just said. So thank you again for coming.
You're very welcome.
Founder fans, again, I apologize. My sound hasn't been great. I'm trying to keep quiet, though I love chit-chatting with Dr. Jane Calvert for coming, and thank you again. Go in the linked description below. Lauren saying thank you to Dr. Jane. Check out I got it right before, the complete works and selected writings, volume 1, in the description below. I got it wrong. She's here. Go to the link below, learn about John Dickinson. Dr. Calvert will be back, I presume. She's been gracious enough to come a few times. I'm going to convince her to come back. I'm sorry again about my sound, but there's a bunch of you here who have been watching, and there's less likes than viewers. So if you guys could slam that like button on your way out, make sure you subscribe if you're new here for content that usually has better sound, and we will be back with trivia for you tomorrow.